And we work with multiple topics of research, and also we engage with multiple stakeholders in disaster risk reductions. We acknowledge the complexity of the disaster risk reduction, and it should be handled with comprehensive approaches and should be with inclusive approach too. And bridging the research result into practice in one of the certain challenges. I think all of us are aware of this. That's why for some time we have put our slogan as our organization slogan as communicating science, enhancing resilience. This means that we are committed to connect every corners and every dots in disaster risk reduction. And of course, one of the important aspects is psychological approach in disaster preparedness. This is also why then we are very happy to contribute and also to collaborate with you all in this project, psychological preparedness of at-risk Indonesian community of the disaster, or we call it Prepared project. Just to inform you that we at TDMRC conduct a regular monitoring and evaluation of long-term tsunami disaster recovery in Aceh. And one of the recent findings that we found after more than 1 decade of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, we found that unsynchronized city master plans in coastal city here in Aceh, especially from the aspect of housing development around the coastline, it's rather discouraging in promoting the idea of build back better. I think we are aware with the concept of build back better, part of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction that we all agree to implement until 2030. But the concept of the build back barriers indeed demands strong commitment from different actors, especially during the recovery process, to identify and also to grab the opportunities. The earliest phase of the recovery is very important phase that we need to conduct that in a very systematic and also in a very coordinated way, especially to formulate the appropriate recovery programs. From the aspect of psychology, the most concerning one that we found that post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, it might not be detectable at the early phase of the tsunami recovery process, but then it built up as the most concerning and long-term effects of the disaster itself. At TDMRC, our researchers found that after more than 1 decade since the tsunami disaster, the manifestation of that the undetectable and untreated mental condition were emerged and transformed into various mental illness, what we found and what we observe until now. So at the present, the access of mental health services here in Aceh has been relatively good since our local government has established the model that called Aceh Model Mental Health Care System since the early phase of the disaster recovery process. On the other hand, it might have been a bit late for the early treatment of PTSD, but with the current better access of mental health services, better coordination among health sectors, down to the community level, and the formulated interventions can be readily available for those in need. Probably this is a kind of response after disaster, what we call here in a Prepare project more on disaster preparedness aspect or before the disaster it happened. So this might be intercorrelated and very much influenced to each other. So that's why we need to sit together and to talk about what we can do from the psychological aspect before and after the disaster it happened. Other gigantic disaster happened recently in Indonesia. We found the 2018 Lombok Earthquake, and then the 2018 Palu Donggala tsunami, and the 2018 Mount Anak Krakatau tsunami. All those three events, we worked with several university and also research institute to observe the recovery process, and we found that the stories of the disaster and the post-disaster effects repeat themselves at every disaster that we assessed recently. We found also some similarities among them, and this reiterate the important works on psychological aspect before and after the disaster. Ladies and gentlemen, before I ending my remarks, allow me to again thanks to Faculty of Psychology of Universitas Gadjah Mada, Poltekkes Ministry of Health of Indonesia in Mamuju, and Australian Embassy for this very important initiative. And we are at the DMRC very happy to welcome the ongoing collaboration and would like continuously to collaborate with you all of course, in longer period. And thank you again. Congratulations to all the participants, speakers, and also the committee for this very important event. And I return this forum to Miss Master Ceremony. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Chudik, for the welcoming speech. Okay, last but not least, we will hear a welcoming remark from Mr. Zaki Irwan, SKM MKes, the Vice Director of Poltekkes Mamuju, who will represent the Director, Mr. Haji Andi Salim, who is unable to be here with us today. So, Pak Zaki, floor is yours.
Ya, terima kasih atas kesempatan yang diberikan kepada kami. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Assalamualaikum. May peace be upon us all. First of all, allow me to apologize on behalf of Professor Andi Salim, who's not able to attend today, and allow us to also deliver the speech in Bahasa Indonesia. Assalamualaikum, may peace be upon us all. Good morning. May we all healthy. And before I continue with the remark, as Vice Director of the Poltekkes, would like to again extend our apology on behalf of Professor Andi Salim, because at the moment our director is in Solo for a coordination meeting with all Poltekkes across Indonesia. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to extend our warmest welcome to all of you, especially our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Douglas Patton from Charles Darwin University, Australia, and also our panelists, the experts in the field, Honorable Mr. Rahmat Hidayat, Honorable Mr. Mizan Bisri, Honorable Madam Listiati, that will also enrich us with insights, knowledge, and discussion in this morning webinar. Our webinar will focus on understanding psychological perspective of disaster preparedness. This theme is highly relevant with the situation in Indonesia, especially Mamuju, because back several months ago, January 15, 2022, we commemorate 1 year anniversary of 5.6 Richter earthquake. And in addition to that, of course, we are a country that is prone to disaster, specifically in Mamuju. We have flood and landslide. Just recently, May 14, 2022, we experienced a major flood that impact or that created a great loss in our community, because Mamuju is a higher ground, is a higher ground, and we are very prone to flooding and also landslide, specifically in Mamuju and also in general in West Sulawesi. We are very grateful with this collaboration between Universitas Gadjah Mada and also Universitas Syah Kuala Aceh. We are very much looking forward to listen to Ibu Praditya presentation on how us as individual and also as a community come up with best responses as the impact of a disaster, strengthening the ability or the capacity of family to face disaster as well. Our institution have the expertise or has the expertise in strengthening family in health. So family independence and in facing emergency, including health emergency, is very, very important. So strengthening family in responding to emergency is very important. We have our unit or student activity unit that was established to respond emergency situations, disasters happening in Mamuju. That's psychological and mental preparedness closely related to material preparedness, stress management preparedness, and also reduction of risks of mental health post-disaster. We hope that this webinar can inspire us to strengthen our preparedness in facing any disaster. So that is what we are hoping for. We hope that this activity can be of benefit to all of us and can provide insights and solutions for all of us. Now, allow me to end with a message. Work.
Selamat mengikuti webinar hari ini. Terima kasih atas segala perhatian. Mohon maaf atas segala kekurangan. Saya akhiri. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Mr. Zaki Irwan.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. That was our last welcoming remarks. Unfortunately, the representative from Australian Embassy is unable to come with us today. And so we will move to the next agenda. We have a keynote session with Prof. Douglas Patton as our keynote speaker. Prof. Patton will explain to us why considering psychological aspect in disaster preparedness is crucial. Starting from this session, Ms. Rizana Rosemary, PhD, will be our moderator. Without any further ado, Dr. Rizana, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vega. A very good morning to everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I hope you are all in a good spirit and very excited to join in the webinar talking about the psychological preparedness to disaster in Indonesian context. I'm Rizana Rosemary, and I'm very honored to be given the opportunity to chair this webinar with our distinguished keynote speakers, our speakers, and also all these discussants, which I will introduce them shortly. So this webinar, as mentioned, is going to be carried out in two sessions. In this first session, we will listen to a keynote speech by a highly respectful scholars and a researcher in the field of disaster preparedness. Good morning, Professor Douglas Patton. Welcome. Nice to meet you here.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to present you all.
Thank you. So this webinar with Professor Datton, he will talk to us about raising the awareness and knowledge on psychological aspect of disaster. And at the second session, we're going to hear Professor Dr. Praditya Pertiwi disseminate and the initial findings and also like to gain public inputs toward the initial findings of the systematic review of the literature about the psychological factors influencing individual decision to be prepared in disaster and emergency context, especially in Indonesia. So before I I ask Professor Dayton to Patton to give his speech. As you can see, there is an extensive list of Professor Patton's contributions and achievement in the field of disaster preparedness. I will briefly read his outstanding bio. Professor Douglas Patton is a professor at Charles Darwin University, Australia, also an adjunct professor at the University of Canberra, a senior research fellow at the Bandung Resilience Development Initiative, Indonesia. He's also a research fellow at the Joint Center of Disaster Research in New Zealand. And in 2005-2006, he was the Australian delegate to the UNESCO Education for Natural Disaster Preparedness in the Asia Pacific. He was a member of the UNDRR now, RIA, of the subcommittee in 2012 and 2016, and served on the Psychosocial Advisory Committee for the Christchurch earthquake in 2011 and 2013. In 2014, his role as a technical advisor on risk communication with the WHO helped develop the community engagement program for the Ebola response program in Sierra Leone. He has served as an editor in the Australian Journal of Disaster and Trauma Studies as a founding editor, also in many other journals such as the Disaster Prevention Management and the International Journal of Mass Emergency and Disaster. He sits on several journal editors board, including the International Journals of Environmental Research and Public Health Disasters, the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, and he has published 24 books, 136 books chapter, and 200 peer-reviewed journals article, and also supervised 32 PhD students to completion. And very interestingly, Professor Patton was listed in the Stanford University and the Elsevier BP list of the top 2% most cited researchers worldwide. In 2021, the Australian Research Review listed Douglas the top Australian researcher in the emergency management DRR field of research. Congratulations, Professor Douglas, what an outstanding achievement. His research developed and test theories of adaptive and resilience capacity in communities using all hazards and cross-cultural approaches. Current works including developing the tools of disasters. And in the next 50 minutes, Professor Patton will present his keynote speech entitled Understanding Psychologist's Perspective of Disaster Preparedness. He will talk about some key factors, some relevant theories, and the significance of cross-cultural applicability in disaster. Following his speech, we have a 10 minutes Q&A, and those who have questions during his talk may write or type the question or comments in the chat room. So Professor Dr. Patton, without further ado, the time and Zoom is yours.
Thank you. Again, thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. Well, what I'd like to talk about today is the role of a number of psychological and social psychological constructs in
tentang peran kesiapsiagaan psikologis dalam konteks situasi atau kedaruratan. Bencana tentu saja adalah situasi yang sangat kompleks dan akan makin meningkat seiring dengan perubahan iklim, dan kita harus mengambil peran dalam keberlangsungan atau sustainability.
Increasing exposure to meteorological and hydrological events such as typhoons or cyclones and flooding events. More traditionally, preparedness is seen as a proactive activity the basic tenets of the process is to encourage the development of a number of capacities, capability, and knowledges that can help people anticipate what they are likely to experience. And anticipation is very important because, fortunately, many of the events that people need to prepare for are still quite infrequent. They often don't have any direct experience of these events. So if they are going to prepare, they have to project themselves into the future to understand what it is they are going to encounter. And within that context, preparedness is intended to, first of all, increase people's capacity to be able to respond to events. So that is to cope with the circumstances that they encounter, to adapt to the short and longer term impacts that they experience, but also to recover from those events. We've already had an introduction to the concept of build back better, and I'll talk about why it's also appropriate to think about that as a capacity development process rather than building back. That can build on recovery processes, and that brings in the UNDRR's introduction of the importance of current disasters or preparedness that is undertaken when people are actually experiencing event. And one of the things we'll point out is that that's an important area for study because
adalah kita memperkenalkan kesiapsiagaan bencana bagi komunitas-komunitas yang sudah mengalami bencana. Nah, penting bagi kita untuk memperkenalkan pula bagi seluruh masyarakat baik yang sudah memiliki pengalaman
type of event, they must also be able to be applied across different cultures and in increasingly pluralistic societies. It is important that any theories and processes have cross-cultural and multicultural applicability. Theories themselves also have a more general role to play, and that is they can help us understand why there are such substantial differences in people's levels of preparedness. Some people will not prepare at all, others will prepare quite comprehensively. So we're talking about preparedness. What does that actually look like? Preparedness falls into a number of separate categories. And one of these emerging areas in research is the need to understand each of these functional categories as being separate but related. Currently, the sort of common practice is to pull together a number of different activities into one inventory so that people are given a questionnaire containing a large number of preparedness items and they tick off what they have done. However, it is becoming increasingly evident that each of these categories is driven by different predictors. That makes it important to understand that they cannot really be treated as in a homogeneous fashion, that we need to understand more about the different factors that influence different kinds of outcomes. Certainly in Western settings, very few people ever come close to adopting all of these measures. In general, the ones that are most frequently endorsed relate to what is called survival preparedness. So that is things like storing water, storing food, having a portable radio, and so on. And these tend to be the most commonly endorsed events. Now, part of that can be understood as there are a number of psychological biases and emotional reactions that arise to that occur when people are exposed to complex preparedness inventories. So one of the things that people gravitate towards simple to adopt and cheap to adopt measures like storing water. Now, when people see that the fact that they're easy to adopt and cheap to adopt elicits a very strong positive emotion, and that predisposes to do them. However, when people look at
bahwa ada hal-hal yang mudah diadopsi, mereka akan lebih siap siaga. Tetapi kalau kita berbicara soal kesiapsiagaan struktural misalnya tentang bagaimana cara mengamankan rumah aman bencana dan sebagainya, masyarakat akan melihatnya sebagai sesuatu yang kompleks, sesuatu yang mahal, dan oleh karenanya akan menanggapi upaya-upaya tersebut secara negatif ya, karena oh ini mahal, oh ini sulit, harus melibatkan perubahan struktur, perubahan arsitektur misalnya. Nah, padahal juga kesiapsiagaan struktural menjadi salah satu kesiapsiagaan yang sangat penting, karena kalau kita pikirkan ya seberapa banyak pun kita punya persediaan makanan, seberapa banyak pun kita punya persediaan air, kalau rumah kita runtuh, tentu saja ya tidak akan terlalu banyak berarti ya. Nah,
the hazard event that has occurred. If they can stay in their home, they become available to help their neighbors and others in their community to engage in the initial stages of recovery. If they can stay in their community, then they are available to support the social and the economic recovery of the community, both as employers or employees, as well as consumers. So understanding how to develop these more costly areas of preparedness is very important. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest issues in this area is that again, I'm not sure what the situation is in Indonesia, but in the countries that I work in, particularly in New Zealand, Australia, levels of preparedness tend to be very low. And most of the strategies that are adopted simply assume that low preparedness results from a lack of relevant information. Now, let me give you one example. This is the results of levels of preparedness for a volcanic public education program that was undertaken in Auckland in New Zealand. And what you see in front of you, the data, I mean, the percentage of people that have prepared is the outcome of 5 years of public education. So in about the year 2000, there were some indications of some volcanic activity in Auckland, and that prompted the development of a comprehensive public education program. Now, after 5 years, clearly not much is being done. I'm also focusing on this because it also introduces some of the theoretical work that I will come to. I can see is that people were quite happy to adopt the some of the sort of survival mechanisms, like having an emergency kit, but their levels of knowledge and their levels of community engagement were very low. So this is quite a significant problem. And this was, 5 years worth of public education. It was looking at several $100,000 were spent on this program, and it had no real effect on people's preparedness. And more importantly, is that when people were asked, are they likely to undertake any kind of preparedness in the future? And you can see here is that generally over 50% said that no, they would not do anything in the future. Now, this is in the context of continuously being told about the impending risk. And they had no problem accepting that they were susceptible to experiencing volcanic crises, but that did not translate into their preparedness. And this provides a good introduction to why it is important to include in understanding of preparedness processes the concept of anticipation. So there are a range of, there's a lot of research that's being done to understand why people will not undertake action. So these act as constraints on people's anticipatory thinking. Now, these are just an example of some of the sort of commonly occurring ones. So things like return periods. The general practice within countries like Australia is to present risk in annualized terms. So we talk about a 50-year flood or a 100-year earthquake. And people tend to interpret that very literally. They assume that it will not occur for 100 years or 200 years or 300 years, rather than it being there's a 1 in 100 chance of it occurring in any particular year. So they will not engage in those activities. Another reason is what's called unrealistic optimism. People tend to assume that compared to others, they are less likely themselves to experience a natural disaster. So effectively, they transfer the risk to other people. So it's not them that needs to prepare for events, but others that need to prepare for it. So this transfer of risk to others results in people not really seeing the risk as applying to them or as applying to where they live. They move the risk somewhere else. Risk compensation is where people transfer the risk from themselves to societal agencies that have a responsibility for managing natural disasters. So they will transfer that risk to the local council, national government, the fire services, anybody they see as responsible for managing these events. Other processes like anxiety, people who are anxious experience psychological anxiety, will tend to avoid anything that reminds them of the thing that they're anxious about. So they will tend to cut themselves off from any information about potential disasters. And so they effectively remove themselves from engaging with the preparedness process. Similarly, things like denial is that when people are told about a need to prepare, they can react in a number of ways. Some people react by saying, okay, I need to do something. But some people who have not prepared are more likely to engage in denial, and that is they deny that the information is relevant to them. And that can become quite significant because part of that denial can express itself in terms of they are believing that the agencies that are providing that information don't know what they're talking about. So they disengage from the process. Fatalism is a more sort of generalized belief that undermines people's willingness to act because they relating to things such as locus of control is that they tend to see themselves as passive victims of whatever happens, and therefore they don't see the point of acting. In terms of socio-environmental beliefs, amongst Western people, one of the people develop different kinds of beliefs about how they relate to their environment.
Yang berbeda terkait dengan lingkungan. Sebagian masyarakat percaya bahwa alam itu bertugas untuk melayani manusia, sehingga alam itu bisa dikendalikan dan sehingga tidak bersikap bertanggung jawab terhadap pengelolaan resiko bencana. Selanjutnya, kendala lain adalah overconfident atau terlalu percaya diri. Ini adalah salah satu isu atau masalah yang sangat besar yang kami hadapi di Auckland. Dan ketika kami bertanya, daftar 5 hal yang akan Anda lakukan saat letusan gunung berapi. Dan 95% Jadi ketika kami bertanya kepada mereka, ini memperlihatkan bahwa
versus the 46% who thought that they could, illustrates this, overconfidence. So people will often assume that knowing where information exists is the same as they're having that knowledge, and that often that undermines their interest in preparing. Final item, look at cost-benefit decisions. Preparing is costly, so people see the costs as immediate, but the benefits might not arise for 20 years, 30 years, and so they don't tend to undertake any activities. And even for rapidly occurring events like forest fires, people will often say that they will wait until the fire is present in their immediate environment before they would think about preparing. And by that time, it's too late. So anticipation is a very important aspect of the preparedness process. Excuse me. Is also quite neglected is that there's relatively little research that is directed to that stage, but unless we address anticipation, it is hard to move people on to the next stage of preparing. So it is important to focus a lot more on understanding how people interpret their risk and how they decide what they're going to do. And in the sort of psychological preparedness literature, most of this is condensed into preparedness theories. Now, there are quite a broad range of theories that have been used to understand preparedness, and I'm not going to go through each of these in turn, but rather focus on one theory, community engagement theory. Two reasons. One, it is the theory that I developed. It arose out of the work that I talked about in Auckland, but it also provides a good opportunity to illustrate the sort of all hazards and cross-cultural applicability of preparedness theories. So, community engagement theory looks like this. The precursor to people's preparedness is outcome expectancy. Now, people can form two kinds of expectancy beliefs. Negative outcome expectancy arises because people do not believe that it's possible for people to take any action to deal with large-scale natural hazards. One of the main reasons for this is that people's hazard cognitions focus on the natural process themselves. So they believe that if they cannot control an earthquake, they can't do anything about it. So they don't engage in the preparedness process. And so they will often do nothing. Positive outcome expectancy, on the other hand, one of the dominant themes that drives that is people's focus on the consequences of hazard activity. So earthquakes cause ground shaking causes buildings to collapse. Therefore, you can do things to strengthen buildings or secure their the contents of buildings. Now, a belief that it's possible to intervene does not necessarily equate to knowing what to do. And community engagement theory argues that the next stage is a two-stage process. When we deal with uncertainty, the way in which we construct our understanding of risk is through social processes. For most natural hazard events, they're infrequent and they're complex. So people talk with those that they identify with within their communities to understand the nature of their risk. So risk is a socially constructed phenomenon. If people construct the risk, they then have to work out what they can do in order to manage that risk. And the theory proposes that in order for that to happen, it is more likely if people have collective experience of working with one another in order to manage any events within the communities. So collective efficacy allows people to put their ideas into practice. However, it is also understood that, again, given the infrequent nature of events, people do rely on external agencies for information and resources. However, they do not take information or resources at face value. Whether or not they engage with communities, whether or not they engage with agencies is a function of their experience of whether or not the agency has empowered community action, and if it has, they're more likely to trust them. And these are the two issues that came out of the Auckland work. People were not engaging with the preparedness process because they didn't feel that Auckland Regional Council was empowering them to act. The information that they provided didn't meet people's needs, and therefore they didn't trust the community. So rectifying this made it important to link these elements together. Now, the UNDRR discusses the importance of all hazards preparedness. So community engagement theory has been tested against a number of events. Here's the outcomes of the work on earthquake, tsunami, pandemic, flooding, and bushfire or forest fire preparedness. So it has sort of low to moderate effect sizes in supporting that. But it does provide some evidence that the theory does work across hazards that differ quite substantially in the kinds of preparedness knowledge and activities that are required. The other issue that is identified in the UNDRR's in the Sendai Agreement is the importance of a theory having cross-cultural applicability. One of the UNDRR's goals is to increase opportunities for international collaboration, cooperation, and learning. And in order for that to happen, it is important that we can identify common frameworks that can be used in different countries to support preparedness interventions. So the community engagement theory, as we're looking at some of the work that's been done for earthquake preparedness. So I compared earthquake using community engagement theory to test for earthquake preparedness in New Zealand in the town of Napier. The picture there shows prior to the Christchurch earthquake, Napier was the last.
Di New Zealand dan kami juga sebelum bencana di Christchurch, New Zealand, kami juga membandingkan dengan bencana yang terjadi pada tahun 1931 di negara tersebut. Selanjutnya di Taiwan Tengah juga mengalami gempa bumi dan kami membandingkannya dengan kejadian gempa bumi 10 tahun sebelumnya. Dan di Jepang, ya ini fotonya sebenarnya foto dari Kobe, bukan dari Kyoto. Ini adalah foto yang digunakan untuk meyakinkan masyarakat untuk beralih dari negatif atau beralih dari antisipasi hasil yang negatif ke harapan hasil yang positif. Ya, jadi gambar-gambar seperti ini itu membuat masyarakat kemudian mempertanyakan kepercayaan mereka. Artinya sebelumnya kan mereka meyakini bahwa aduh namanya bencana atau gempa bumi khususnya nggak bisa diapa-apain deh gitu. Padahal ada foto-foto yang menunjukkan atau bagian dari proses edukasi masyarakat kita menunjukkan foto-foto, oh iya ada bangunan yang hancur tapi ada yang tidak. Artinya ada sesuatu yang bisa dilakukan. Nah, kemudian kita melihat skor yang kita melihat bahwa di New Zealand itu pendekatannya lebih individualis, dan di Jepang hingga di Taiwan pendekatannya makin kolektif, dan pendekatan kolektif ini kemudian mendukung kesiapsiagaan, khususnya kesiapsiagaan terhadap gempa bumi di komunitas ini. Dan selanjutnya kita berbicara dalam konteks atau CET dalam konteks kesiapsiagaan gunung berapi atau bencana gunung berapi. Kami kalau kita berpikir soal gunung berapi itu kita sering berpikir bahwa oh iya letusannya berasal dari satu tempat yang sama atau single point. Jadi pada dasarnya ada ada magma di bawah perkotaan ini ya, yang atau di gunung berapi di bawah perkotaan, dan ada beberapa dan akan meletus sewaktu-waktu, dan terjadi dalam jangka waktu yang berbeda-beda ya. Ada yang terjadi sampai 750 tahun sekali misalnya. Jadi ketika meletus ketika meletus, kemudian laharnya itu akan mendingin, dan cara pandangnya bahwa oh iya dijamin tidak akan terjadi letusan di daerah yang sama lagi. Padahal kemudian penting bagi kita untuk melihat letusan gunung berapi ini agar lebih siap siaga untuk letusan berikutnya. Yang kedua ini di Yogyakarta, dan yang ketiga juga di Jepang, ini kotanya namanya Kigoshima. Kigoshima itu sangat menarik. Orang di Kagoshima sangat terbiasa untuk
The school uniform for Kigoshima's school children is wearing a hard hat, is because you are going to experience some small volcanic products occurring. But it is important in Kagoshima to appreciate that it erupts frequently. Again, comparing Indonesia, Japan, and New Zealand, there are some can see the similarities between the way in which the model plays out. It is noticeable in Japan that trust was not endorsed in the analysis, and that's the sort of exception that proves the rule, in that trust is important when people face uncertainty. People in Kagoshima are very used to dealing with volcanic eruptions, and so they know why preparing is important. So trust is not a major factor. So in terms of preparedness, we can argue that it is possible for psychological theories to provide information on all hazards and cross-cultural applicability. Now, just because the theory can be applied in that way, it doesn't mean to say that the variables are developed and enacted in exactly the same way. And we're starting to look at the way in which culture-specific and cultural general processes can be combined. So this is a fairly sort of preliminary work, but the theory itself is a cultural general process, is that it has applicability across many different countries. But if you look at the social and constructs that exist in Indonesia, in Taiwan, and in Japan, they are quite different. So they can, understanding the rules of these different constructs can inform the way in which we understand how the core variables in the theory are understood. From a practical perspective, understanding the relationship between the culture specific and the cultural general is very important, because that's how the practical applications are going to work. So it's quite an interesting area to work in, and I'm certainly happy to discuss this in more detail later. Now, before we get to that stage, also look at how does preparedness occur in recovery settings, in the context in which disasters have occurred. So looking at data from two events. One is from the Christchurch earthquake in 2010 and 11, and the other is from the 921 or Chichi earthquake in Taiwan in 2009. So although people tend to be ill prepared before natural hazard events occur, people do tend to adapt or develop in situ ways of reacting. And these analyses were undertaken using sort of a life course interviewing technique, which allowed the process to be understood as it unfolded over time. On the bottom of the diagram, all kinds of events that people had to, consequences that people had to deal with. Again, in terms of the origins of the factors that are driving this, is that people's interest in structural preparedness tended to be an interaction between people within a family context. Now, this is quite a significant issue, because currently very little is done to actually accommodate the family in understanding the way in which preparedness outcomes are encouraged. Interaction between family members was also important in terms of developing a commitment to frankly sort of staying and working on how to adapt to particular events. As events unfolded, relationships between the family and the community interacted to influence the way in which people would get together to develop a collective resource to work through sort of neighborhood issues. And in the long-term recovery and rebuilding stage, it was again family interacting with community, but interacting with more institutional and sort of government resources that were important in how they manage these events. So at present, there is very little done in countries like Australia and New Zealand to develop a systematic understanding of recovery in or preparedness for recovery, and the different ways in which different levels of society interact in different stages to influence what happens. In Taiwan, similar issues emerged, although there was quite a significant difference. In Taiwan, as a collectivistic culture, the family was the basic unit of analysis, not the individual. And family community relationships were much stronger, much more closely integrated than others. The data from Taiwan in Tongxi is a Hakka community. The Hakka are one of the sort of largest ethnic subgroups within Taiwan, and they possess a very interesting sociocultural construct called the Hakka spirit, which provides a number of resources that help them deal with adversity. There were also some important issues within Taiwan that were not present in New Zealand, particularly the importance of living in harmony with the environment and recovering in ways that help build better relationships with the environment. Taiwan was also unique in that part of the governance process following disasters is that the government will set up reconstruction centers for a period of 3 years, which are designed to help communities recover, but usually to develop alternative ways of livelihood to support long-term recovery. So understanding these contexts is quite important. So there were similar processes involved in both Taiwan and New Zealand that allow for a foundation for future research into understanding recovery processes in an international context. And one of the ways in which we've been looking at how to do this has been, when I talked earlier about using the community engagement theory that was developed in Australia, developed in New Zealand, and then applying that to other countries. We've been working with some colleagues in Taiwan to go the other way. So in Hoping Village, following the 9/21 earthquake, the town was cut off from the rest of the country. And what was interesting was that they developed their own social recovery process, which they called community consciousness. And some years after they developed this, we did some interviews with the community members and then a survey, which sort of culminated in developing a model of the sort of adaptive resource that they developed. So far, we've not had an opportunity to test this in terms of its predictive ability for things like preparedness or recovery. And a lot of that work was put on hold with the advent of COVID. But in terms of developing that sort of international applicability, if we can develop models in the West that can be applied in Asian countries, and then we can develop models in Asian countries and apply them to Western countries, we are in a better position to move towards realizing the UNDRR goals of developing more universal capabilities to manage disasters at an international scale. So in terms of some of these sort of emerging work, this sort of that last example is that one of the goals of the UNDRR is to develop some kind of universal theory that combines culture general and culture specific processes in ways that afford opportunities for countries to have a systematic framework for collaborative learning and research. This also means that if we develop that kind of framework, it also becomes available for developing countries who would not be able to afford the kind of research that's required to develop preparedness models, to be able to use these models without having to incur these costs. But if we have that shared sort of framework, then it means that we have a greater potential for international collaboration, international learning, and to look at the fundamental areas of similarities and differences. There are also some sort of interesting areas of developing. One is to move away from a risk management-based approach to a community development-based approach, to look at transformative learning and capacity development, and also thinking about the different ways in which we can communicate. So why should we get rid of or focus on community development rather than a risk management approach? Now, a risk management approach is one that focuses, first of all, on the natural processes. So it assumes that earthquakes are the fundamental starting point for this. Now, one of the reasons for arguing that we should move towards community development arises if you look at the sources of the variables that influence preparedness. So we've seen is that we're looking at sort of family influences. Family dynamics are not influenced by whatever happens within from a risk management perspective. There are also a number of variables that derive from people's life experiences. So things like self-efficacy scores do not come from risk management. They come from people's lived experiences of resolving problems in their everyday life. People's sense of community and community participation derives from the degree to which they immerse themselves in their everyday social lives. not from sort of emergency management. So the sources of these variables come from life experience, and because of that, they become more amenable to change through community development processes. There are actually very few variables that are influenced directly by risk management or emergency management processes. There are some that are influenced, but only when the risk management process complements community development processes. So these become or provides grounds for thinking about different ways of conceptualizing preparedness. Now, one of the other benefits of a community development approach is in the amenability to developing practical intervention strategies. So community engagement theory was used to develop a community development strategy to increase wildfire, forest fire preparedness. So it started off by tailoring processes to map a number of different communities. This involved a study, a pre-event and a post-event evaluation starting in 2014 and finishing in 2016. So it identified, this is BRN as bushfire-ready neighborhoods. So 6 communities were identified to receive this community development program, and 6 communities simply received the normal public education programs that were available. So community development processes were used in order to create shifts in scores in these sort of core variables. And the outcome of this was that in the BRN communities, there were significant shifts in a number of core parameters, particularly in terms of increases in the adoption of structural preparedness, which I mentioned earlier is very important, greater sense of personal responsibility, higher levels of collaboration and neighborhood planning, stronger sense of community, and so on. Whereas in the non-BRN communities, there was no change over the same 2-year period. So levels of preparedness and engagement remained low. Part of the origins of this process was really in terms of understanding that each of the variables used in the theory relates to people's life experiences and therefore can be influenced through a community development process. So it's quite important. We also need to rethink how we conceptualize preparedness. Theory testing is important in its own right, because it is important to test theories for their utility, but these still have an important role to play in providing sort of evidence-formed frameworks for action. But no one theory provides insights into all the factors that influence outcomes. They tend to focus more on factors that have a recognized positive influence on outcomes, but they ignore a lot of the factors that act as constraints on preparedness. Now, if we start to think about preparedness in terms of this more sort of comprehensive framework, we can begin to anticipate a number of different eventualities. So it draws attention to the need to understand that at any point in time, a community will comprise people with constraints, communities with constraints, and societal government agencies that act as constraints. But it can also have positive personal, positive community, and positive agency factors that are driving this forward. So if we're going to increase preparedness, then we need to understand more about how these factors are interacting, and the fact that which factors are present in each community are going to differ depending on the nature of that community. Again, it might be an interesting area for the discussion. Now, we're still a long way from how to put this notion into practice. But one thing that is becoming clearer is the fact that we need to think about preparedness as a developmental process. As talked earlier, is that for many people, they do not anticipate their future. And so it is important to understand that at any point in time, there are people who have already decided not to do anything. So we need to develop strategies that shift the way of their thinking. So we can improve, or we can bring people to the point where they can start to think about preparing through a number of strategies. So again, there are a number of these, and certainly happy to provide information later on. Once we get people to start to anticipate, we can start them thinking about what they would want to do. And very important here is getting them to personalize what is going to happen. What does it mean for their family? What does it mean for their employment? Nothing to do with the hazard itself, but to think about what are the personal consequences that might be mitigated through better preparedness, and providing information not from formal sources, but preferably from people that they can identify with. So stories from other communities where they've had successful outcomes are much more accessible, and people are much more interested in seeking advice from those sources. Once people get started, they become more open to taking in more complex information and understanding the nature of hazard impacts and the way in which they can be mitigated. And in terms of system facilitating adoption, one of the areas we're looking at is particularly looking at more sort of collaborative learning processes. And that involves people who are well prepared play a role in teaching other people about how to prepare. So community leaders using collaborative learning processes can help develop these processes. So it makes for a much more cost-effective process and a more targeted process if the preparedness process is situated more clearly within a specific community, rather than external agencies providing sort of more sort of generalized information, which often does not fit with sort of individual capabilities. Now, in terms of some of the, how are we doing for time? Are we okay? Need another 5 minutes?
Yes, Professor, we could give you more about 5 minutes.
Okay. We're talking about the sort of build back better construct. Now, I prefer to talk about this as transformative learning and capacity development rather than, build back. We can't go back. We can go forwards. I'm looking at looking at communities that have actually done this effectively. So this was a conceptual model that was developed by drawing on 3 case studies where transformative change occurred and which has resulted in very different ways of relating to hazards. And that's with 2 communities where emergent capacities arose, but they didn't continue beyond that. And we just started to look at applying this or testing this model. This is data from, Australia had some very bad forest fires in 2020. And one of the towns that was very severely affected was a town called Cobargo. And this is looking at how Cobargo were developing internal processes to help them recovery and to develop strategies to manage future events. Fundamental to this was, consistent with the conceptual model, community collaboration was vital. The sources of the raw materials for this collaboration came from people's pre-existing individual and collective capabilities. So it really calls for strengths-based approaches to what we or how we develop community capacity, not people coming in to offer advice, but looking at how do we take what people already do and help them to mobilize that. So that was important. Community leadership was important in terms of coordinating and driving that process forward, and that resulted in greater social cohesion within the community, a greater capacity for self-organization, and the development of new ways of relating to their environment, which created a number of new institutions, which transformed the community and how it is going to deal with future events. And the final issue is about one that I'm interested in, because songs seem to be a very common characteristic of many disasters. I've been quite interested in how song lyrics and music can be used in order to engage people in preparedness context. Now, the arguments for this are twofold. One is there is strong evidence that songs and music are very important sources of forging identities and facilitating engagement. And it does so from people from a vast range of backgrounds. But there have also been a large number of songs that are written about disasters. Obviously, these are in English, but there are songs that have been written about the consequences of ignoring warnings. There have been songs that have been written about the importance of preparedness. There have been songs that have been written about the potential for people to develop sort of resilient responses. So these are quite important, because these are songs that are written by people that have got nothing to do with risk management or emergency management, yet they can capture key elements that could serve to support different ways of engaging. And this was a result of a thematic analysis of about 100 or so disaster-related songs. And disaster songs fall into three different categories. There are songs that are about coping. There are songs that are about sharing knowledge about disasters and hazards. And there are songs about sharing experiences. So one of the areas that I think would be sort of interesting to develop is to really explore whether or not this can be added to the range of strategies that are adopted. And it's largely because, firstly, songs tend to emerge spontaneously in many disaster-affected communities. Songs, poetry, a lot of different kinds of artistic endeavors tend to arise for people to capture and share their experiences. Now, there are a lot of issues to resolve about this, but I think it's interesting to comment. But anyway, that's it. Thank you very much for your time, and I apologize if I've gone over the time limit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Douglas Patton. What a wonderful presentation. I'm myself very astonished of your comprehensive presentation, displaying and presenting about so many of your present research. And I believe there are so many people out here who are very keen to ask you more about this presentation. Thank you very much. And it's very interesting, especially at the last presentation about the needs of including songs and lyrics for preparedness to disasters, and also about the involvement of the community development or life experience of people for disaster preparedness. So I see here in the chat room there are already two questions from the audience, but for the other audience who would like to ask Professor Douglas Patton regarding his speech, please do not hesitate. There is a question from Bapak Dimas, who is a pediatrician working at the Member National Disaster Task Force of Indonesian Pediatric Society. He would like to ask you, Professor, about the preparedness that you can share that focus on children, since we know that children along women and elderly are the most vulnerable aspect as the victim of disasters. So can you share to us about the psychological disaster preparedness in children that we can implement or at least extrapolate to reduce the disaster? Thank you.
Well, probably an area that I'm I'm not sort of directly involved with. I did some work some years ago, but I can certainly send through a lot of information about children and disasters. Certainly, there are interesting developments in terms of not seeing children as automatically as being vulnerable. Is that often that they can become involved in a range of ways, and if they are capable of doing so, they benefit a lot from sort of increasing their sense of control in a period when they often experience very low levels of control. Children are also very responsive to the reactions of their parents and teachers and other significant adults in their lives. And one of the areas that we worked on after Christchurch was about the importance of increasing parental knowledge and teachers' knowledge about how to understand their own reactions so that they were not transmitting problems to children. So children are often very passive recipients of that sort of information. So if they see that significant adults that are worried and concerned, that they will pick that up. If parents are more involved in their own recovery activities, then that tends to present a more sort of positive framework for how to recover. There have often been concerns with parents is that you don't share your anxieties with your children, and that depending on the emotional maturity of the children, it can often be better to discuss these issues as a family rather than to assume that children are going to experience negative reactions. So in countries like New Zealand and Australia, it's often assumed that children will suffer or will experience poorer emotional responses compared to adults. In some of the work we did in Taiwan, they have a very different approach, and they tend to provide children with very realistic disaster simulations because it is more important for children to build their understanding of what they're going to experience and how they are going to feel in the event, and then have opportunities to talk about it. So schools would often run earthquake drills where the morning was creating very realistic scenarios. And that included having children volunteers who were covered in fake blood and buried under, and the fire service would obviously put them chairs and things on top of them and then show how they were taken out. It involved training teachers in terms of how to evacuate children, how to deal with these issues, but they would create very realistic scenarios for children to experience what they would encounter. So the morning session was a simulation, and then the afternoons was a Q&A session for all parents to attend who wish to attend, for teachers, and for a panel of experts to talk about how best to handle particular situations. So there are national differences in how these events are undertaken. You get these differences in terms of any disaster is going to be far more significant than any simulation that we can create. But anything that we can do to increase people's experience or awareness of what they're going to encounter will tend to be beneficial. And we often underestimate the capacity of children to actually understand what is going on. And as I said earlier, it can often be more damaging to not talk to your child because it's very clear to them that things are not going well and that their parents are concerned. But if they don't understand that, then there are problems. And the same is true in schools about teachers being willing to talk about their concerns and what they might do about it. But the key thing is always to focus on, if you feel like this is what you can do to deal with it. So that there are practical strategies to identify. it does require some assessment of how children are dealing with the event. So if you have a child that is clearly traumatized or badly stressed by an event, then it's better to work through that before they are involved. But it's also important to understand where those fears are coming from, because often it's not necessarily the event, it's how others around them are reacting. And if they don't understand those issues, then that's a problem. Similarly, sort of providing more peer support. So if we're getting children back into school so that they are with their friends, and as long as that's not supportive relationships, that can also be helpful. And that requires sort of also training teachers in terms of being on the lookout for potential problematic situations.
Thank you, Professor. Very comprehensive. I hope Mr. Dimas is well received with the answers. I would like to take questions from the audience here. We have one raised hand from Bapak Billy P. Silintu. Bapak Billy, you may ask the questions.
Thank you, Bu, for the opportunity. Professor Douglas, thank you very much. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Billy, and I've been entrusted to handle organization-based resilience. We call it as youth impact during disaster. And this is exactly what your good self has told us of how to involve community. We ourselves are preparing this. And we are gathering volunteers from inside the organization and community volunteers. But talking about a psychological impact to it, I would like to know, is there any way that we can simulate a certain disaster, let's say eruption or earthquake or flooding? Because I think by having the real life scenario will be the best teacher. Thank you.
I think in terms of simulation, volcanic eruptions are quite difficult to simulate because of the consequences that they create. It is possible to try and identify some of the sort of core issues that can be created. The earthquakes are actually fairly easy to simulate. Again, from the example in Taiwan, is that because they would take whole buildings and people would volunteer to be very realistic victims of these events, and it's possible to create the kinds of internal problems that arise in terms of collapsed furniture, collapsed walls. Earthquakes are also that where things are secured to the walls or fixed down. Computer monitors are strapped down. There is not much that takes place. Whereas on the other side, it is very clear that if you were in that room, you would be killed because your bookcases, your furniture, your television set would have been thrown at you with quite considerable force. And that is quite useful, I think, because to experience what that shaking is like. And I think earthquakes are also interesting in that nobody has ever been killed by an earthquake. People are killed by buildings. If you're out in the open and an earthquake occurs, the worst that can happen is you'll be bruised because you will get thrown to the ground with quite some force. But earthquakes don't kill people. Volcanic eruptions of tsunamis certainly do, but creating those kind of simulations are quite useful. The simulations are quite expensive to set up, but they are very effective. Although I work with them, I'm living in New Zealand. I know what it's like in Indonesia, but I experience lots of small earthquakes all the time. But in that the simulation room, it was very informative to experience what it was like to experience the level of shaking and the violence of that shaking that occurred over a prolonged period of time. And although it's only 1 minute and 58 seconds, it seemed like a very long time. And that's where you're already sitting down, you're on, the floor is all nice and soft, so there's not much to injure you, but it's very useful. But other things like in creating buildings that can create the kinds of consequences that can arise and how to deal with them, that's easier to do. Flooding is very hard to simulate because it doesn't actually take much water to become dangerous. So in fast flowing sort of flooding areas, once you get to about a few centimeters, that'll be enough to wash you away. So it tends to be restricted to really only sort of professional emergency responders who will undertake that kind of work. And in other events, with volcanoes, you can't really recreate the kinds of impact because volcanic ashes, it can be toxic, and usually if you simulate any use of that in buildings, it will create significant problems for that building. But it is possible to use substitutes to illustrate things like how to secure your house from volcanic ash, to stop the volcanic ash entering the house, how to clean ash off your roof, how to clean ash off cars, and those are things that could often are very sort of small scale, but they are very important in terms of reducing costs. So, I know that in New Zealand, when we had in some of the eruptions in the past, is that a lot of the costs were from people not understanding how to remove volcanic ash from cars. So they would often hose it off, and because it's highly acidic, is that they would end up with very badly very damaged paintwork. They would often forget to clean underneath the windscreen wipers, so you had hard ash. So as soon as you used those wipers, you couldn't see through the windscreen because basically it just scratches everything. But if you use other kinds of fine powders like sort of talcum powder or something that's similar that's non-toxic, then it is possible to run sort of drills in terms of how to remove that. So in New Zealand, the things like car yards are often sort of benefit from that because obviously they're the ones that have most to lose, but it can also apply to the public.
Thank you very much, Professor Douglas. It's very interesting, right? Pak Billy, I hope you could also satisfied with the answer. I'm really sorry. I would like to take all of these questions. There's so many questions, Professor Douglas, but because of time constraint, I just have to move on to the next session. But if you don't mind, maybe we could collect all these interesting questions. Some of them are similar, and then we could compile them all, and maybe we could just assess
1 minute
the time too.
About tsunami. 1 minute about tsunami. I want to ask for Professor Douglas, how about the tsunami? Because the tsunami also the health provider to be the victim, such as in Aceh, also in south of Java. Thank you very much. How to handle emergency response, also disaster preparedness from psychologist, also from emergency team. Thank you very much.
So for tsunami?
Yes, for tsunami.
Yeah, well, I think it's a fairly challenging question. The best way for any tsunami, the best response is to get to higher ground, and usually through sort of vertical evacuation. So rather than trying to run inland, try and find the nearest, you need at least about a 3-story building. If you can get up to the 3rd floor, then you're reasonably safe. Again, but it assumes that the building itself has been constructed with tsunami risk in mind. And even some buildings that are designed to deal with that, depending on what happens. There can be problems. I think that it's very telling that with the tsunami in Japan in 2011, a lot of the issues arose is because it was that nobody appreciated the ground subsidence that would occur because of the earthquakes. And so tsunami barriers that were designed that would have, under normal circumstances, contained the tsunami that occurred. But because of the subsidence, the wall effectively dropped 1 meter, and the tsunami then sort of overtopped that. And if you rely on, I mean, that's one of the, when I talked about risk compensation earlier, is if you have large tsunami walls, is that the people that live behind those walls will often be less vigilant in what they do, because they assume that the wall will give them sort of not optimum protection, and that is not always the case. But for some tsunami evacuation, there are public in most tsunami. The first thing that people do is to contact their loved ones. The second thing that people do is to contact somebody they trust to find out if it's really happening. The third thing that they will do is that rather than evacuating, they will actually often go to help people that they know that might be in trouble. And most of those actions will tend to reduce the time that's available for them to respond and move out of harm's way. And many of those issues are down to bad planning, so that families don't talk about, you know, what do we do when if the kids are at school? Do we know what is going to happen in that school? If they don't know that, then the first thing they will do is try and find that out. But if they know in advance, is that when the tsunami occurs or anything else occurs, that the children will be evacuated to a specific location, then they don't need to worry about that. And the same for the children, is to know that that their parents, what they will do. We don't tend to plan very much for things like what happens if an event occurs when we're at home versus when we're at work. So thinking about all those eventualities and communicating those within the family, so that people are in a position where they can respond immediately, and they're not going to be putting themselves in a position where they then have to find something out. And the most significant constraint, and the one that's harder to resolve, is that people's tendency to want confirmation, because these events are unthinkable. But if they try and call around and they don't know, is again, every second counts. And so developing those sort of planning sort of elements are very important, so that the more people know what is going to happen, the easier it is for people to act without having to wait to find things out or to check on things that are happening. And often is that problems are even greater because telecommunications can be the first thing to go, is that telephone lines, mobile cell towers can be knocked out fairly quickly. So if you don't know these things in advance, it's, again, the problems are sort of self-induced rather than manageable.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor
Thank you
Douglas.
very
Thank
much,
you.
Douglas.
Thank you, Pak Muhammad Fatoni, for the questions. I'm very sorry just to have to end this session, but don't worry. And we are fortunate that Professor Douglas Patton will still be here around us until the end of the session. Thank you very much, Professor Patton, for staying for the next session too. So if there's any questions alongside in the second session, maybe we could raise it up also. So let us move to the next session. In this session, we will listen to Dr. Praditya Pertiwi presentation on the initial findings of the Prepared project. And then we're going to, she's going to present the paper or the presentation in 30 minutes, follow up by response by our discussants, by our 3 discussants. But before that, I would like to read her short bio. So Praditya is not only my close colleague, we completed our PhD in the same university. But I think she's also a young, bright scholar and a researcher who has completed her master as well her PhD within the 4 years at the University of Sydney. So her research focuses on the intersection of psychology, disasters, development, and inclusion. She has also published so many publications in peer-reviewed journals and also some book chapters on the topics. Now she's currently a lecturer and a faculty member in the Faculty of Psychology, Universitas Gadjah Mada, and also the principal investigators for this Prepare project, which she will explain further in details. So as the chair and also as a friend, Ms. Titya, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rizana, for that very, very generous introduction of mine. And again, perhaps let me start by saying thank you very much to Professor Douglas Patton for setting the scene in why we need to understand the psychological perspective of disaster preparedness, and perhaps trigger and motivates us to think or rethink again the model of disaster preparedness by considering all the psychological aspects based on what the extensive research that Professor Douglas has also shared with us earlier this morning. Please allow us to share our research finding with regard to this topic. So actually, our motivation or our study comments with the motivation exactly what Professor Douglas shared on one of Professor Douglas' research finding from New Zealand. It's when we look at the past years with the COVID-19, for example, there are a lot of how negative psychological response associated with ineffective response to the COVID-19 itself or other natural hazards, disaster or emergencies. I believe Professor Douglas has shared many examples from different countries, but here is just few examples, actually 2 examples from the Indonesian context with the disbelief, the denial, and disobedience resulting from people's behaviors that perhaps hamper the anticipative or preparedness measures. Another examples from the natural hazard disasters earlier in 2021, as what the Vice Director of Poltekkes Mamuju shared with us earlier, that during the Mamuju earthquake in 2021, many people, especially migrants, left the scene instead of lending hand or helping people to cope with disasters and help to recover. One of the communities or among those who fled the scene were psychologists as well. So it impacted the access of psychosocial support for affected communities during disaster recovery. So, however, because our curiosity at the time is when we thought about, we would like to understand further what is actually the aspects of psychological, the psychological factors that influence people's decision to prepare. At the time, it was COVID, so we weren't able to do empirical research because of all the field restriction. So our research that we will share today is a systematic literature review study. So based on the published research on psychological preparedness in Indonesia. So these are the 2 review aims. So to unpack what are the constructs of psychological preparedness from published literature. So this evidence is actually, or this study is actually part of a bigger project, the Prepared project, to develop a psychological preparedness measurement tool in Indonesia context that we hope can be used as a process tool for communities to understand the level of psychological preparedness that perhaps can enhance physical and material preparedness and a more effective stress management during disaster events. So we adopted 2 review questions. How is psychological preparedness understood and measured in Indonesia context? Because at the moment, all the published literature on psychological preparedness perhaps Majority of them are outside Indonesia context. There are lots in the Australian, including those that Professor Douglas has published. And then the second review question are what are the construct of psychological preparedness based on this available literature. So for the systematic review protocol, we adapted from Boylan and Lawrence earlier study in 2020 that did similar research to understand what it means to be psychologically prepared, but in Australia context. So we adapted with few modification. So in terms of keyword, we tailored that with the review aims, questions, and also the context of Indonesia. And we only include peer-reviewed literature because we want to ensure the quality of the research that we review are in a rigorous form. And we include those articles published in English and in Bahasa Indonesia. These are the database that we use for English article and Indonesian articles. These are the keywords, and also following Professor Douglas' community engagement theory, we also look at all hazards. So we don't specify specific hazard for this systematic review study. And these are the keywords for Indonesia in English. So the inclusion criteria, we include published literature from 2004 because this due to following the Indian Ocean tsunami, where the notion of disaster preparedness or disaster risk reduction started to emerge or popular in Indonesia. And I believe after this period, there are more research looking at the preparedness aspect of disaster rather than the response. And the scope of the research is the psychological preparedness to disaster and emergencies, including the pre-disaster and emergency setting. The context is in Indonesia, and publication type empirical research, including those that use qualitative, quantitative, mixed, and multi-method approach. I already mentioned the languages earlier. So we did the review in November 2021 until May 2022, assisted by a systematic literature review free software called Ryan. And each review stage is administered by the two team members independently. And there is also a third person in case there's disagreement or differences during these different stages. We did appraise all the selected articles using the mixed method appraisal tools, and we are currently in a very initial stage of analysis using the thematic analysis. So I'm very grateful with this event. We would like to hear from Professor Douglas as well as from the discussants what they review and perhaps comment on the study itself. So these are the results of our identification and screening. We found around 3,266 articles from those database, but only 14 that we included in the study for further analysis because of these reasons that we already mentioned on the right side of the graphic. These are the selected articles. From the 14 articles, we want to mention that these are all hazards as well as from different locations of Indonesia. So it also considered different, perhaps in a different context of culture that hopefully will make the result of the studies richer in the context of Indonesia. And including Professor Patton's and Dr. Saud Sakala's research in Yogyakarta as well. So our initial findings found three themes, very emerging themes that we would like to present here and would like to seek feedbacks. First of all, there has been a limited research on psychological preparedness in Indonesia. Of the 14 studies, psychological preparedness is referred to as a construct or variable itself with like a defined concept, usually adapted from foreign or international literature, but also psychological preparedness is referred to as psychological aspect of community preparedness. There hasn't been any definition of psychological preparedness in Indonesia context. So 3 out of 4 studies providing definition of psychological preparedness adopted from the concept from such as Resser and Morrison in 2009, and as well as Zolk in 2012. Only one study from IAZIRA in 2009 defined psychological preparedness. However, there is unclear evidence based from this definition. For example, if the study using like the Preparedness Theory approach, or if they use a systematic review. So there hasn't any trace of those evidence base for this definition. In terms of measurement, there hasn't been any standardized measurement as well of psychological preparedness in Indonesia. Of the 4 study use the PPDTS, the psychological preparedness for disaster threat scale from Zolk in 2012. Interestingly, each with different version. So the 31 items, 26, and the 18 items. And there's no further information on the adaptation of this tool in Indonesia as well. So due to the PPDTS, the construct of psychological preparedness that we found really relying on international literature, and mainly we found at the individual level factors. For theme 2 regarding the construct of psychological preparedness, it is actually resonates with what Professor Douglas has shared earlier with the community engagement model. And then we found around 20 constructs of psychological preparedness or psychological factors that influence the intention to prepare of Indonesian communities. Of these 20 factors, there are 13 that we identified as within individual factors. For between individual factors, it means that there is a relation across individual and as well as at the community level as well. But also interestingly, there's an influence of a psychological factors coming from the higher level, like for example, institution or the environment at this particular level. So those perhaps I believe nearly similar or resonates with what Professor Douglas has mentioned earlier. However, here I would like to perhaps highlight 3 factors that might be different or are unique to Indonesian that we found from the systematic review study. First is the religiosity. It includes also the sense of religiosity as well as the worship culture or worship practice of the Indonesian communities that they influence their belief and also perceive risk of disaster and as well as their security following disaster. For example, when they think that there is a bigger force outside of this disaster that might influence whether they will be safe or not in disaster. And then the second factors that I would like to draw on is around inclusion. This is also perhaps we have touched on earlier, started from the opening session from the head of the DMRC and also from some of the participants that asked about the women, children, elderly. We also see the factors that influence intention to prepare is also inclusion, especially for marginalized community, because for those who are marginalized, including children, women, elderly, and people with disabilities, there are lots of environmental factors that hinder their attempt to be prepared in disasters. Therefore, this sense of inclusion will allow them to access and have more better within these individual factors that determine their level of preparedness. And the last factors that I would like to draw your attention on is the role and support from the institution and community leaders. I believe Professor Douglas has also mentioned about agencies. This is also evident in the study that we are conducting at the moment, is that the support from the community leaders itself somehow provide influence on the psychological aspect of their community. Because we are currently at the very initial stage of analysis, therefore the relation between these factors has yet to be defined and require further examination. For example, using further statistical analysis. One article, for example, also clustered this factor into cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. So we were thinking as well if these kind of factors can also consider across these three different level of psychological aspects. And then the last theme for our finding is the type of psychological preparedness, of which we would like to hear as well from Professor Douglas and all the discussants. So the psychological preparedness, there are two types that we found from the articles. The first one is the psychological preparedness coming from individuals to prepare themselves in disasters. But also, we also found the psychological aspects for them to prepare to help others prepare for disaster. So it's kind of to being a volunteer or a sense of agency of this individual. The second type of psychological preparedness we found in 3 articles, especially those who discuss marginalized community that I mentioned earlier, that for those who are marginalized, they have difficulties in trying or attempting to prepare towards disasters. Therefore, the help or aid from others who have more agency, like a peer, for example, a peer person with disabilities or peer elderly, for example, can help them be prepared better. So this second type of psychological preparedness is for those who have motivation to help others to prepare as well. And this was influenced by empowerment, their individual competence and confidence, trust, institutional support, and as well as sense of community. However, the relation between these two types of psychological preparedness has yet to be investigated. So, for example, whether the person who has the second type of psychological preparedness need to have the first level of psychological preparedness first before they were able to be an agent or be a volunteer for disaster preparedness. So we haven't investigated further. So the limitation of the study, 10 out of the 14 selected studies use quantitative approach, of which usually adapting concept or psychological preparedness from published conceptual framework. Therefore, there are limited on grounded approach to understand actually psychological preparedness in Indonesia context, utilizing more qualitative methods. Therefore, perhaps we saw earlier in the theme 2 that all the aspects might resonate with the international literature and only a small amount that is probably unique to Indonesia literature. So I think perhaps a recommendation of that can be like a further study utilizing a more grounded approach for that. And then the studies cover participants from early adulthood to older age, including women and people with disabilities. However, we haven't seen a study represent the view of children until adolescence, as well as in the setting of household or family level. So for the way forward, carry on from this research, we would like to develop a psychological preparedness to disaster tool in Indonesia context, which will be under expert review as well as field testing tools in 3 areas to consider the different culture and cross-culture context of psychological preparedness. And we also, once the tool is tested, we will invite disaster volunteers, perhaps who are interested to learn about this tool or more about psychological preparedness to provide capacity development for them as well. That's all for the presentation. Thank you very much. I would like to hand over back to Dr. Rizana for the moderation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Praditya Pertiwi, for presenting our initial findings of the Prepared project. It's still undergoing project, and we're looking forward for more feedbacks and inputs to the improvement of this project later on. So continue, we're going to hear some response from our 3 discussants. Before that, I would like to introduce our honorable discussants. Bapak Dr. Rahmat Hidayat. Bapak Dr. Rahmat Hidayat, thank you for giving your precious time to be here. He is the Dean of the Faculty of Psychology from Universitas Gadjah Mada Indonesia. And discussion 2 is Bapak Dr. Mizan Bisri. Bapak Dr. Mizan Bisri is an assistant professor at Kobe University and currently the principal of KARI, stands for Cerdas Antisipasi Risiko Cari Kamera ID. Welcome Bapak Mizan Bisri, and discussion 3 is Dr. Listia T.S. Palupi, Master of Development and Practice. She's a lecturer at the Faculty of Psychology, Universitas Airlangga, Surabaya. Thank you for joining us, Ibu Listi. So I will hand now to Bapak Rahmat Hidayat to give his first response towards the initial findings that Miss Praditya Pertiwi has presented. 10 minutes is given to Mr. Rahmat Hidayat. The Zoom is yours.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Rosemary. Good morning, good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Considering that most of the participants are Indonesian, I speak Bahasa Indonesia, and taking into account that the organizer has kindly provided us with simultaneous translation. Therefore, I ask your permission to do my comment in Bahasa Indonesia so that the translator will have some words to translate into English. Pertama, sekali lagi saya mengapresiasi apresiasi untuk Mbak Dia dan tim dan sponsor untuk melakukan riset ini. Di 10 menit ini saya diharapkan untuk memberikan tanggapan tentang sejauh mana konsep psikologi sudah diakomodasikan di dalam riset ini, dan kemudian bagaimana kita nanti bisa mengembangkan dan mendorong riset-riset lebih jauh tentang kesiapsiagaan psikologis di komunitas kita untuk menghadapi bencana, and some improvisation along the way. Tentu saja, semoga 10 menit nanti akan memadai untuk itu. Yang pertama, saya ingin menggarisbawahi terlebih dahulu bahwa dari sisi psikologis, kesiagaan masyarakat Indonesia menghadapi bencana itu sebuah enigma, sebuah fenomena yang ganjil. Kalau kita ingat bahwa salah satu prinsip belajar secara umum dikatakan bahwa pengalaman adalah guru yang terbaik. Dari pengalaman kita terus-menerus meningkatkan diri, mengembangkan diri. Di sisi lain, kita jelas mengetahui semua bahwa Indonesia sangat berpengalaman menghadapi bencana, segala macam bentuk bencana. Tetapi dengan demikian harapannya adalah bangsa Indonesia, karena salah satu yang paling berpengalaman di antara semua bangsa di dunia ini, mestinya adalah termasuk bangsa yang paling siap menghadapi bencana, paling wise menghadapi bencana. Tapi di setiap situasi kebencanaan, kita masih selalu melihat kegagapan baik pada sistem publik untuk menghadapi bencana tersebut maupun pada masyarakat menghadapi bencana tersebut. Ada sesuatu yang salah di dalam proses belajar kita. Proses belajar masyarakat kita sedemikian sehingga pengalaman yang berulang kali, yang sangat kaya, yang sangat beragam, dalam durasi yang tidak terlalu lama ini, tidak translate into learning, tidak translate into skill, and overall preparedness kita untuk menghadapi bencana. Ini menjadi satu pertanyaan yang saya kira nanti patut dipertimbangkan di dalam riset ini. Kemudian yang kedua, saya ingin menggarisbawahi yang disampaikan oleh Profesor Pan tadi, bahwa kesiagaan menghadapi bencana adalah sebuah konstruk perilaku yang dibangun di atas fondasi cara berpikir atau fondasi aspek kognisi di dalam masyarakat kita, di dalam diri individu. Karena itu menggali unsur-unsur belief, perception yang ada di masyarakat terkait dengan bencana menjadi sangat penting. Catatan kritisnya nanti adalah keywords apa yang dipergunakan, terutama dalam tahap pertama riset ini, dalam tahap literature review. Karena berbeda disiplin dan bahkan berbeda peneliti nanti akan memiliki kemungkinan menggunakan keywords yang berbeda, dan tentu dampaknya nanti akan menjadi sistematik di dalam tahap systematic literature review ini atau literature review ini. Kemudian yang ketiga adalah bahwa dorongan untuk menjadi lebih siap menghadapi bencana itu sifatnya tentu saja motivasional, unsurnya mengandung baik unsur kognitif maupun unsur afektif emotion, sebagaimana di dalam teori-teori kognitif emotional theories of motivation yang berkembang di waktu-waktu belakangan ini. Sehingga dengan dasar tersebut, maka di dalam riset ini perlu menggali faktor-faktor afektif emosional yang terkait dengan bencana. Nah, dari hal-hal tersebut, yang pertama saya ingin memberikan sorotan terhadap rancangan dari tahap pertama, yaitu literature review ini, systematic literature review ini, terutama terkait dengan keywords yang dipergunakan. Saya catat dari presentasi Mbak Ditya tadi, terutama saya ingin menyoroti dua, yaitu terkait dengan psychological preparedness. Di dalam tahap ini, kesan saya adalah peneliti menerjemahkan psychological preparedness ini di dalam literature as it's, begitu. Jadi yang dicari adalah keywords kesiapsiagaan psikologi, kesiapsiagaan mental, kesiapsiagaan emosional. Saya menduga bahwa di dalam literatur, di dalam publikasi riset-riset yang dilakukan di Indonesia, keywords yang dipergunakan lebih luas dari itu. Misalnya, representasi sosial. Ini terkait dengan belief, apakah bencana itu? Ini setidaknya di salah satu riset yang saya lakukan sekian tahun yang lalu, kalau tidak salah publish di tahun 2009, saya menggunakan konsep ini, representasi sosial tentang bencana. Ini dari riset itu saya temukan bahwa bahkan gempa bumi yang terjadi tahun 2006, 2 tahun sebelum saya melakukan riset dengan sponsor CRC, kalau tidak salah, Religious and Cultural di Sekolah Bahasa Sarjana UGM dari Temple University waktu itu sponsornya. Bahkan bagi pemuka agama pun di pemuka agama, guru agama Muhammadiyah di Bantul, di Pleret, satu hotspot gempa bumi ketika itu. Gempa tidak dimaknai sebagai gempa ketika itu. Gempa ketika itu berdasarkan pengalaman dan persepsinya sendiri, itu merupakan ulah dari pasukannya Ratu Laut Selatan, dan dengan berbagai argumentasi untuk menjustifikasi belief dia tentang apa itu bencana. Ini menggambarkan bahwa riset seperti ini mungkin akan terluput kalau tidak keywords representasi sosial atau representasi kognitif atau persepsi tentang, karena di bagian yang lain sudah ada keywords bencana, kemudian atau persepsi atau keyakinan, atau mungkin juga beberapa menggunakan istilah local wisdom. Ini untuk menggali apa yang sebenarnya dipikirkan oleh masyarakat, apa yang diyakini oleh masyarakat tentang bencana. Nah, setidaknya saya sudah melakukan beberapa penelitian payung dengan mahasiswa saya, masih sudah sangat lama sebenarnya, sebelum tahun 2014, ketika saya masih lebih fokus kepada riset-riset kebencanaan ini, menggunakan konsep-konsep tersebut. Beberapa sudah publish, dan saya menduga bahwa itu tidak termasuk di dalam 13 artikel yang mungkin memenuhi kriteria karena keywords yang tidak tepat itu. Jadi saran saya kalau masih memungkinkan ini dimasukkan, atau kemudian dilakukan SLR berikutnya dengan menggunakan istilah yang lebih luas ini. Kemudian yang kedua, ini terkait dengan pencarian konteks. Saya cek di beberapa artikel, itu kata Indonesia tidak ada. Jadi dengan menambahkan Indonesia, tapi tidak menambahkan alternatif, ada kemungkinan beberapa riset yang tidak menyebutkan Indonesia di bagian manapun di artikelnya, itu nanti tidak masuk. Alternatifnya, kemungkinan Jawa, Sumatera, atau Major Islands bisa dimasukkan untuk lebih memberikan peluang terjaringnya artikel ini. Nah, dengan tambahan artikel-artikel yang direview, tentu harapannya nanti akan hasil yang lebih luas dari SLR ini, Systematic Literature Review ini. Berikutnya yang saya kira perlu disoroti juga adalah bahwa rasio antara riset dengan publikasi di Indonesia sangat rendah. Most research do not end up in publication, in academic publication. Nah, termasuk banyak riset yang saya lakukan bersama mahasiswa ini juga teguran untuk saya sendiri yang produktivitas publikasinya masih sangat rendah. Karena itu saya kira memperluas pencarian di repositori di beberapa kampus, saya kira menjadi opsi yang patut dipertimbangkan. Saya yakin nanti akan populasi yang memenuhi kriteria, sekalipun yang terjaring memang sudah banyak, tetapi yang memenuhi strict kriteria atau kriteria yang dengan beberapa tambahan tadi akan meningkat. Nah, dari sana kemudian saya kira akan terlalu panjang nanti kalau kemudian saya melanjutkan diskusi tentang thematic finding dari survei ini. Harapan saya nanti setidaknya dari sisi konstruk yang terjaring akan lebih luas, dan itu kemudian menjadi penting karena tahap pertama riset ini bertujuan untuk mendapatkan bahan untuk perancangan instrumen pengukuran, sehingga sesuatu yang sangat mendasar. Nah, yang terakhir, hal yang lain, hal yang kedua yang tadi dimintakan tentang bagaimana kita mendorong riset di bidang ini. Saya kira yang pertama sudah dimulai oleh riset ini, kolaborasi antar peneliti dari berbagai lembaga di Indonesia and beyond. Ini perlu dilanjutkan, Fakultas Psikologi nanti akan terus mendukung, setidaknya nanti mendukung Mbak Ditya dan teman-teman yang lain untuk lebih mengembangkan kolaborasi tersebut. Yang kedua adalah pelembagaan. Saya kira ini salah satu peluangnya adalah kajian tentang kebencanaan sudah sangat banyak dilakukan di Fakultas dan Departemen Psikologi di Indonesia, ada sekitar 190. Namun asosiasi yang khusus tentang itu belum ada. Yang ada saat ini adalah bagian atau division di Ikatan Psikologi Indonesia, Indonesian Social Psychology Association. Ini ada apa namanya, divisi untuk mempelajari psikologi kebencanaan. Tapi psikologi kebencanaan aspek-aspeknya luas, tidak hanya dari aspek psikologi sosial. Karena itu saya kira adanya asosiasi ini yang nanti akan memungkinkan scholars across the disciplines untuk berkolaborasi akan jadi lebih kuat. Dan yang ketiga, yang terakhir, saya kira nanti fungsi apa namanya, research register nanti bisa dikembangkan untuk melakukan apa namanya, memfasilitasi kolaborasi bahkan dari tahap yang paling awal riset untuk menghindari redundancy dan sebagainya, itu nanti perlu dilakukan. Saya kira demikian, maaf sedikit agak melebihi waktu. Ada kurangnya mohon maaf. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih sekali Pak Rahmat.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Dr. Rahmat Hidayat. Very interesting feedback and comment, highlighting on the keywords used and also some resources. Maybe Dr. Praditya would like to give comments or response to what Dr. Rahmat Hidayat has mentioned.
Yeah, briefly, but really thank you very much, Pak Rahmat. These are all great points that we will take into account within this project or a follow-up project. If we develop one, it will be very greatly benefit the concept that we will carry on and the activities that we will develop afterwards. Thank you, Pak Rahmat. Matur nuwun.
Thank you, Dr. Ditya. Now let us move on to our second discussion, which is Dr. Mizan Bisri. Welcome, Bapak Dr. Mizan Bisri. Now you have 10 minutes. You can give comments to what Dr. Praditya Pratiwi has presented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. It's good to see you again, and thank you very much, Bu Ditya, and also Pak Rahmat Hidayat for the kind invitation. It's an honor for me to provide input and also hopefully can contribute to the preparation, the implementation of the prepared project as a whole, and not limited to the result of the initial systematic literature review that Ditya has presented earlier. And I fully agree and would like to echo what Pak Rahmat has mentioned with all the points about the selection of keywords, the systematic literature review process, and also to move forward in terms of research in this area. I was assigned to respond to the following two questions: how psychological preparedness can contribute to disaster preparedness in general. And I would like to bring in my perspective as a urban planner turns into political scientist, and now also implementing or managing an ICT startup for disaster management. So hopefully this can resonate and also can provide input for the project as a whole moving forward. And second, how psychological aspects have been considered and integrated in disaster management research and practices in Indonesia so far. So in this context, of course, how psychological preparedness can contribute to disaster preparedness in general is it's by making intervention at individual level meaningful at community and societal levels. And I think we have witnessed various pathway and concept and also theories that Professor Patan has presented earlier during the keynote session. So the key is really how to empower psychologically prepared individuals to be involved at community resilience efforts or even in the political arena of the society itself, either at city level, regency level, province, or even national. And I think these three, linkages between what or to what extent the psychological readiness or preparedness of an individual, how it can be collected, gathered, how the data about these individual can be captured, and how it can be utilized and inform the design of the strategy, programming, planning, and budgeting at the community and societal level would be very much important. What I understood so far is that this research will also link into a development of tools that look into individual level psychological readiness and preparedness, and there is an initial preparation towards the development of an app. So this is not only a research at the upstream, but also there is an action research element on it, and allow us also to contribute in this front based on our experience developing ICT tools and web-based asset is that please do consider the demand and the empathy itself. So what's actually the user needs? Please don't look at it as just the sensor. Don't treat the user of this app later on just as the data source or the sensor for the research itself, but do consider and have empathy about how this can contribute to the well-being, the psychological readiness of the users themselves. And please also and we are happy to collaborate in terms of design thinking and design process to ensure that there is a great usability both for the research front and also usability for the users themselves. And lastly, please learn from the existing disaster-related and psychology-related apps. And on this front, I can also attest that many of the web-based or even disaster-related app in Indonesia mostly designed from the provider's perspective and least from the user perspective or the client. So this is something that perhaps can be looked upon moving forward. And this is important because the way the team approach this at the end of the day can significantly improve and very much needed in the era of big data and tech 4.0 to understand, to have more pulse that can understand the risk, people's behavior that at the end of the day can be used to design a better preparedness for the future. I just want to show this This is the numbers of the pulse of the data that, in terms of weather stations and etc. And we do need more data points, pulse from to gauge the individual psychological readiness from the community at the local level. And perhaps learn and use individual data already available in the market. I think the marriage between ICT and psychology is one of the area where we witness a lots of disruptions. I don't want to promote some of the apps already available, but I think even in Indonesian market, there is already app tapping into psychology data. So perhaps why don't look into the usability of the data already generated by those companies, and perhaps instead of starting from scratch, the creation of the tools at the end of the day can leverage in the data sets that already available. And hopefully at the end of the day, the data points for understanding the vulnerability and capacity at the individual levels can be further married with the hazards modeling, forecast, and so on, so that we can have not only a deterministic point of view of the risk, but also the probabilistic into the future. And I think there are two potential determinants and areas for interventions in Indonesia in this front. And this is, I want to bring in my perspective as political scientist, is that equally important to the attempt that the Prepared project is currently undertaking is to assess the psychological preparedness and also how it affects decision-making and cognitive capabilities of the local leaders, city mayors, head of disaster-related NGOs, head of local village, and etc., and also disaster-related professionals. And I think, again, the marriage between these two areas can be very much important in terms of designing a better and a more resilient Indonesia in the future. And the second area and challenges, I think, is about how research like the Prepared project can, at the end of the day, helping to support creating a critical mass of psychologically ready individuals and also communities that at the end of the day can make the city or at the societal level genuinely resilient. How to measure it? I think the Prepared project will contribute through the development of tools and also the app, and from there we can have a more robust theory testing and application and policy making. On the second front, in terms of the how psychological aspect have been considered and integrated, I think the general comments is that I think this is still a few and more works needs to be done collaboratively. When we look into our data sets that already consolidated Scopus Index Research, Portal Garuda Index Research, and also some of the universities repositories. So this is to echo what Pak Rahmat have been mentioned. We witnessed that within our datasets, studies on disaster psychology identified in our search engine is about 3,199, and only 14 is about psychological preparedness. And I think the team has also looked into this element. And also the remaining is other psychology related studies. But of course, we need to continue with the suggestion from Pak Rahmat to increase the parameter, increase the keywords, and so on. And we are happy to collaborate in this front as well. And to add in terms of how we can understand better disaster psychological aspect have been considered, I think unfortunately, again, our comments or input is still a few more works needs to be done collaboratively. And I think next in line, we can collaborate in terms of the preparing Indonesia disaster knowledge update on disaster psychology. We just want to show one example on the early warning systems. And I think a meta study and systematic literature review that try to gauge how current psychological aspect and psychology research is being studied, where, how it links to what type of hazards and how it linked to the disaster management phase. We don't have the answer at the moment, but the hint is that it's still a few and we need a collaboration to understand this even better. So I will stop here. Thank you very much, and hopefully our comments are useful and beneficial for the Prepared project moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mizan Bisri, for an invaluable feedback. Any response to that, Dr. Aditya?
No, really would like to say thank you to Pak Misan to clearly, I think, highlighting the outside, the relevance of the knowledge that perhaps we gain from the study into more applicable, the application in the field for like a building preparedness, as well as like with the apps. I think there are lots of inspirational suggestions that perhaps we would like to collaborate with Pak Misan and colleagues at Shari moving forward. Yeah, Pak Misan, I will be in contact soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ditya. Now let's move on to the third discussion. Dr. Listiawati Setiopalupi. Dr. Listiawati, please give your comments in the next 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. Is my voice heard? Audible? Am I audible? Okay, thank you. Okay, it's such a great pleasure to meet all of you today. First, I would like to thank to Ibu Pladitya that made me do my homework in a very limited time to a very short notice invitation to participate in this webinar. However, it is an honor for me to have a preview of the initial findings of prepared projects, and also to interact with distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Douglas Patton, and prominent discussion, Bapak Rahmat Hidayat and Bapak Misan Bisri. I would also like to thank to Faculty of Psychology Universitas Gadjah Mada to host this webinar. In this session, I would like to emphasize an important message that are drawn from the speakers through psychological preparedness for disasters, challenge, and opportunities. To begin, I would like to underline the key points that are shared by the speakers, Professor Douglas Patton and Ibu Praditya and her tips. Professor Patton, in his presentation, has provided us with an important definition of preparedness. He's also discussed about how psychology would play a role in understanding community and individual disaster preparedness in facing all hazards. He also provides the functional preparedness category that could be used as a guidance in considering what elements that need to be included in measuring disaster preparedness. He also identified and described prominent theories that are often used in understanding disaster preparedness, such as health belief model, protection motivation theory, trans-theoretical model, person relative to event theory, and he also proposed community engagement theory as a framework to understand disaster preparedness that could be applied across cultures and in all hazards contexts. He also highlighted the opportunities for future studies in the field of disaster preparedness. Next, please. Okay, thank you. Ibu Praditya and her teams has done an outstanding review of the psychological preparedness studies in Indonesian context, especially, which include articles from disaster, psychological preparedness, mental preparedness, and emotional preparedness field. In the presentation, they identify 3 themes that emerge from the study. The themes are measurement, construct, and type of psychological preparedness. In these initial findings, they found that there has been a limited research on psychological preparedness, especially in Indonesia context. The finding also shows that most of the available research was only using a certain method, which mostly is quantitative approach. And they also found that there is still limited study that apply qualitative methods to understand psychological preparedness. In the initial findings of the project, they also stress the need to develop a psychological preparedness measurement tools and applying expert review and testing validity and the reliability of the tool using a confirmatory factor analysis, and also conducting a disaster volunteers training. From the speakers, next please. Thank you. From the speakers, we learned that understanding and explaining psychological preparedness is not an easy task. The initial findings of the Prepare project has identified obstacle that was in line with my experience in doing research in the field of psychological preparedness for disasters for almost 4 years now. The challenges that occur in studying psychological preparedness or lack of comprehensive definition of psychological preparedness that could be applied in all hazard contexts across culture, as highlighted in Professor Patton's speech. Although there are challenges to study psychological preparedness, but it doesn't mean that it is impossible to study the construct. From the initial findings of the Prepare project, we could find several opportunities for further move the psychological preparedness study by providing a comprehensive definition of psychological preparedness that could be applied in all hazard contexts across culture, and also applying a multi-method approach to define the construct. Both of the speakers here has provided us with an enlightenment on disaster preparedness and how psychological approach could contribute in the disaster management field. The information that they have provided has corroborated the importance of psychological preparedness in reducing the risk of disasters. Those also accentuate the significance of psychological preparedness for disasters to be integrated in the disaster management, not only in the Indonesian context, but also worldwide. I believe that we should start to think of the way on how we could improve disaster preparedness in the individual as well as in the community level. So, by considering the devastating impact of disasters, I would like to raise a future question that we need to think of. Please move to the next one. Okay, so please move to the question, please. So this is what should we do to improve disaster preparedness within ourselves and our community to face disasters. Hopefully, through this today's discussion, we could holding hands and build a strong partnership to answer this question together hand in hand. Thank you. Matur nuwun.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ristiati. Very interesting and important feedbacks. Before I move, Dr. Ditya, is there any comments or a response towards Dr. Ristiati comments?
Yeah, Ibu, thank you very much for the appreciation and also sharing your experience. I believe your experience also resonated with us and you faced the similar challenges that we also found in this study as well. So it really, pleasing to hear that from you, as well as the suggestion that you provided. We have taken that into account. Thank you, Ibu.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Ditya. Our time is very limited. I know it's we're going to end at 11:30, but before I share, and I would like to ask the audience also to give their inputs or feedbacks towards our initial findings. I would like to hand over to Dr. Douglas and would like to know his thoughts about what Dr. Ditya presents. Dr. Douglas, are you still with us?
Yes. I think for me, some of the issues are about the challenges of understanding country-specific knowledge. When you were talking, I was reflecting on some of the work that I did with a Japanese colleague who said that there were something like 60,000 articles in Japanese on disaster risk reduction that people in the West will never access because they don't know how and they couldn't read the work anyway. I think that it's very important that we start to develop more country-specific research, and the basis for that's a collaboration, because it's not appropriate to just import Western theories because they are developed in highly individualistic contexts. Many of the theories are developed in the USA, and the USA is a cultural minority. It is also not where most of the problems occur. We like 70% of disaster-related losses occur within the Asian continent. So looking at developing more work in that context. And I think the work is very important because I think we have a lot for me, living outside. I mean, as a Westerner, I have a lot to learn from what you can contribute in terms of how Indonesian culture and society develop their understanding of disaster risk reduction in a sort of a wider sense. I think that's important not only because of the increase of incidence of disasters, but also is that we have to learn different ways of thinking. I've also been working with Australian Indigenous populations, and there it's not just about knowing more, it's developing different ways in which I can know about how people relate to their environments. And in Australia, we have an Indigenous population that's been doing this for 60,000 years. Western Australians have been doing it for 250 years. So I'm just very supportive of what you've found and encourage along the lines of some of the earlier speakers to start to look at how we find out more about what is going on. And I think there's also there are a lot of reports that are written that never actually get published that are very important. We're also being to look at what is coming out of communities and what they see as important. So I think your work is very important. I think the discussants also raised a number of important issues, but also issues that I think need to be debated more widely. And I think that that's an important step sort of moving forwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Douglas. Dr. Ditya, any response to that?
Yeah, lastly, I mean, your work has inspired all of these, Professor Douglas, and thank you very much for that word of encouragement as well. We will continue on like this process, and we'll certainly engage more with you if we have, implement all the activities and updates that perhaps we can have more updates for you with regards to this process as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ditya. Unfortunately, because this is Friday and some of our male Muslims are going to go to the Jum'ah prayer, so unfortunately we cannot share and ask the audience to give feedbacks on this project. So there's no conclusion because I cannot conclude. This is still an ongoing project, but I would like to highlight from all the keynote speakers, from Dr. Ditya itself and our three beautiful discussants, that they still need more learning collaborative to move forward and improve this prepared project. I would like to thank Professor Dr. Spayton, especially. Thank you very much for your precious time, Professor. Thank you for being with us and for the invaluable inputs. Dr. Praditya Pratiwi, our three discussants, Dr. Rahmat Hidayat, Dr. Mizan Bisri, and Dr. Ristiati Espalupi, for the valuable knowledge and information about the psychological disaster preparedness. And I undoubtedly that all of the inputs have provide constructive inputs for the next stage of this prepared project. I would like also to thank the Australian Alumni Award, and particular the AGS and the Australian Embassy, the webinar organizers, and most importantly, all participants who have joined and participates in this webinar. We hope everyone gains benefit from this event. As chair, I apologize for any improper statement and behavior that may occur, and I end the session and hand over this mic and Zoom to our beautiful MC, Ms. Vega. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rizana. Ladies and gentlemen, we finally reached the end of our session. Thank you for coming to this webinar. We hope that this event will deepen your understanding of psychological preparedness to disaster. It has been our pleasure to host this event, and we look forward to seeing you at another event. So I wish you all a pleasant day. Thank you, and don't forget to be psychologically prepared.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Douglas.
Thank you, everyone. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, everyone. Terima kasih, Bapak Ibu.
Thank you.
Sampai jumpa.